Okay, let's recap Act 2 of Romeo and Juliet. I hope you guys are doing well. I truly miss all of you and learning together and laughing together and all the fun that we had in room 320. I think this week's agenda will kind of reflect that. There's not a whole lot on there. I'm kind of giving you some space this week to get caught up on things and perhaps other classes. I know that this is all stressful, so I'm trying to give you a little bit of room with that. Hopefully the agenda reflects that. Let's recap Act 2. So, like Act 1, it begins with a 14-line sonnet for a prologue, and this kind of goes over the change in Romeo. His old desire is his love for Rosaline, and that's in its deathbed. It's dead, it's gone. And it's been replaced with this new love, or some believe infatuation, with Juliet. It also talks about how their relationship will be kind of difficult and dangerous because of their families and because they are enemies. And it basically just talks about how it will be hard for them to be together. Scene 1 is Benvolio and Mercutio looking for Romeo. This is a bit of dramatic irony. They think that he's run off with Rosaline, when we, the audience, know that that is not the case and that he is way over Rosaline. I also just want to point out the timeline of the play. It seems like this has been going on a while, but this is the night of day 1. And the entire play really only covers about a week, which is pretty crazy. A lot happens. In scene 2, this is the famous balcony scene, and we have these famous lines from Juliet saying, "Oh, Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou Romeo?" Wherefore meaning why, not where. And then she says, "Deny thy father and refuse thy name, or if thou wilt not, be but sworn my love, and I'll no longer be a Capulet." So here she's speaking out loud. She is not talking to Romeo, she's just thinking her thoughts aloud, which is also known as a soliloquy. However, Romeo overhears these things, so he knows that Juliet would forget her family to be with him the first night that they met. And later, Juliet's kind of embarrassed about that. So this is kind of an important part of the conversation, which isn't even technically a conversation yet. And then once they do start talking, you kind of see a little bit of a difference between Romeo and Juliet to some degree. Juliet is a lot more practical than Romeo. She asks, logistical questions like, how did you get to my balcony? What are you going to do if someone finds you? And things like that. And Romeo just keeps responding with love. Love carried him there. Love will protect him. And Juliet says, no, well, they'll actually kill you. So she's a lot more kind of level-headed than Romeo, although they do still kind of rush things, because by the end of the scene, they're planning their wedding. So, she's more logical or practical than Romeo, but they're still definitely rushing. And she is kind of worried that Romeo just likes her for her looks and that he will move on quickly. And so she says, I'll send someone to you tomorrow to find out if you still really feel this way, and you can tell them if you really love me and if you want to marry me. Scene 3, this is the morning of day 2. Romeo goes to talk to Friar Lawrence, who is a priest, and to plan the wedding. Friar Lawrence is kind of awesome. He, as a hobby, has a garden and is kind of an apothecary. He makes medicines and potions, which does come into play later in the play. And he's also kind of a mentor to Romeo and Juliet. He helps them out. He seeks peace between the two families. So at the beginning of this scene, he's kind of angry with Romeo because Romeo was in love with Rosaline. He apparently would often talk to Friar Lawrence about his love for Rosaline, but now he has quickly changed his opinion and wants to be with Juliet. So he kind of chides Romeo for that a little bit. But in the end, he agrees to the marriage because he thinks that it can bring peace between the two families. Scene 4 begins with Mercutio and Benvolio. Again, this is day 2 of the play. They are kind of walking the mean streets of Verona and talking about how Romeo kind of skipped out on them last night and this challenge that Tybalt has apparently sent to Romeo's home. And so this would be a challenge to a duel, definitely something to keep in the back of your mind, because Romeo is planning to marry Juliet, and Juliet is Tybalt's cousin. So, in a nutshell, Juliet's cousin wants to fight Romeo to the death. That's not great. Mercutio thinks that he should answer this challenge. When Romeo enters the scene, later in scene 4, we see a very different side of Romeo, and in fact, Romeo and Mercutio kind of go back and forth for a while, really with some pretty dirty puns if you look closely at Shakespeare's language. He gets pretty crazy here. I'm not really going to dig into it so much, but, Romeo says something along the lines of, "Then his pump is well flowered." Things get pretty out there. Feel free to look back at it. Have some fun with that. Mercutio says, "Now art thou sociable, now art thou Romeo, now art thou what thou art, by art as well as by nature." In other words, he says, finally, this is the true Romeo. Romeo's really here. So that's interesting. Romeo's been kind of an emotional, kind of dark, deep guy leading up to this point in the play, and when he's joking around like this, Mercutio says, "This is the real Romeo." So, just something to think about. Who is this guy? And at the end of the scene, the nurse and Romeo discuss and plan the wedding between Romeo and Juliet. Because remember, Juliet was going to send someone the next day, so that's the nurse. And he plans to marry Juliet that afternoon, so their second day of knowing each other. The nurse is ecstatic about this, but she also warns Romeo that there's another guy in the picture, this guy Paris, that wants to marry Juliet. She basically says, I don't think it's any big deal, but just so you know, there's this guy Paris that wants to marry her. And then scenes 5 and 6 are both very short. Scene 5 is a sort of transitional scene where Juliet is just waiting for the nurse to return and give her news of Romeo. And of course the nurse eventually returns, kind of gives Juliet a hard time for a while, and then says that Romeo will marry her today. And then Juliet goes to Friar Lawrence under the guise of going to make confession. That's how she gets permission from her parents to go. And when she gets there, she marries Romeo. Interestingly, Friar Lawrence, right before he marries them, gives this little speech, this little warning, saying these violent delights, meaning sudden, but of course Shakespeare purposefully used the word violent. These violent delights have violent ends, and in their triumph die like fire and powder. Because Romeo and Juliet can't stay away from each other. So he's saying, hey, let's take it slow. When you really rush things, when you are this sudden, it can end just as suddenly. He's not talking as big picture as it turns out to be, but of course it's something that should stand out to us. So that's Act 2 of Romeo and Juliet. I hope you enjoyed it. Next week we'll read the climax of Romeo and Juliet in Act 3. Take care.